Welcome
Okay.
all. It's April 24th, 2023, and I'm Gary Berg-Cross, along with James Overton, co-organizers of this year's Ontology Summit. Uh, you should be seeing on the screen a start on a synthesis draft by myself, which is dealing with this annual topic we had of helping scientific researchers make better use of ontologies, discussing tools, methods, and best practice, and so forth. So this session is a synthesis session, and to help it, I have created some notes, hopefully organized, but very incomplete and sketchy at times, but that we could use this as a basis for our discussion today. And if the organization works well enough, continue on with that for next week when we start to work on a more formal communique, as we say, and Ken can have more things to say about that uh, during the session and at the end of the session. So with that, I'd like to take a few minutes, maybe as many as 10 minutes, to quickly go through this document. And I should put in, let me actually stop for a minute here. I should put in chat a link to the Google Doc where the document is, because people can, during the session and later on, can put in their thoughts, edit it. It's been put together rather quickly, so the formatting is not up to standards, and there are things to do, obviously, like abstract. But let me give you the big picture and just show you very quickly some things that are there. Okay, so I'm proposing a structure for the eventual communique, which will have an abstract, obviously, which will be with an introduction and overview of the topic of helping scientific researchers. And the second part will be a session on what are the current problems as we understand them and challenges, a discussion of the big picture, why scientific researchers, non-ontologists need help with these and what ontologies can be used for. As part of this, maybe we can be active and actually sort of use the forum and some other means to actually survey and gather thoughts on some of the problems. I have a start on it based on what we've heard during a session and other places that this has been discussed. The main part of the document, as of now, is on ontological methods, which I thought provided a framework, because, for example, we needed a framework because the Obo Foundry discussions were discussing this different parts of building, maintaining, and revising, and so forth, uh, ontologies. And so this is a more modern approach than some people might have be familiar with, involving technical details on reuse and things of that nature. So what I propose in this section is sort of talking about very quickly early ideas of what ontological engineering was, and then more recent ones, including modular approaches and the Obo Foundry approaches. I don't necessarily have a single diagram, for example, that describes the ontological methods of Obo Foundry, but that might be created. There are documents and there are some graphics that are useful, I think, as a start. As part of this section, I discuss modular methods of development briefly. And in particular, I organize this thing in terms of different scenarios which have been used to discuss whether you start with non-ontological materials like vocabularies or things like schema.org and so forth, or ontological reuse, such as in the Obo Foundry. And then I illustrate some of these approaches with the various tools that have been discussed. So that's the largest section. I even include something on discussion of a knowledge graph like Ubergraph and Nowhere Graph as a use of ontologies and how to make that use simpler. Then the next section is remaining challenges. And it might be, again, useful to have a table summarizing the various candidate tools that are not necessarily harmonized with each other or integrated, but it might be a good resource to have as part of the document. And then it's conclusions, acknowledgements, and references. So with that in mind, let me just scroll through very quickly what's written here. So the introduction would include links to past summits, discussion of these topics, maybe an Obo Foundry summary statement on the problem or the view of this. And quickly we get into the second section, defining the problem. So I'm not going to do these now, but I'm just going to show you there's quite a few things to say about the problems, a lot of which is that there are problems with OWL language formalisms. We need a higher level approach to that. There are a lot of repetitive things. There are implications when you make changes that are difficult to track. How do you make things interoperable and so forth? And so there's a fair amount of material. There's a stress on we need visualized models for conceptualization so domain people can understand them and isolate them from some of the complexity and so forth. So these are talking about using something like Shackle instead of OWL itself to understand constraints and build and so forth. So that's that's a part of the problem. Then the major section is ontological engineering, with a little introduction to what that is and a example from 20 years ago about that, about how to see ontological engineering without really understanding a lot of the iterative maintenance questions on that. So I've used some material from our presentations, such as Martin's presentation last time, to talk about more modern needs and things that are reflected in Obo, dealing with very complex ontologies rather than a wine ontology. I mean, every now and then there's an error here. And then I contrast that with the NEON methodology, which people might be familiar with. I have an appendix on it, which says, well, there are many ways to start. There are different scenarios, there are many ways to go. And I just use a few of these from the diagram on this. As I mentioned before, non-ontological resources such as schema.org or Wikidata as a start versus reusing ontologies from or other parts of the Obo Foundry and so forth. And then I discuss modular ontology development also as a third approach. And then after that, I get into the details of tools to help you with things like reuse and building things from scratch. These is where I discuss Wikidata and schema science on schema.org. And there's a section on LinkML there in the online version. This is an older version from earlier today. So I get into COB. I'll just go through quickly here what that is, some discussion about what Thorsten said about it as a alternative in another domain. Then I get quickly into populating the ontology using robot and what it's good for, giving examples of some of the functionality. And again, any of these sections can be edited and improved on, either shrunken or built out and related to other things. Then ODK and what it's used for within the development lifecycle and maintenance. So I have some stuff on Otter on another part of the document. Dashboards get into evaluating ontologies as part of the life cycle, very important. And maintenance iteration, I use Oak as an example of some of the things that can be done to understand the ontologies for maintaining them and reasoning over them to make sure they're consistent upon changes. I have a section on Ubergraph as a use of ontologies. And I have a fair amount on Nowhere Graph because we had a fair discussion of that, probably more than we need to be cut down. Then I also go into the Spoke project, which is another one that was mentioned in the biomedical area as an example of an important knowledge graph that uses Obo Foundry ontologies. And then, so that's chapter 3, there's enough in there. Chapter 4, remaining challenges. Again, we might use a table to summarize candidate tools to integrate them. It's one of those issues of what tools are out there with what methods to support what. Can we bring these together from different parts of the community? And I have a discussion of some things that come out of the Obo Foundry discussion of this, things to be done. one of the big issues, of course, is to integrate between the biomedical and other domains and see what we can do in common. So we talk about that as talk about biomedicine, industry, finance, geospace, sciences. And then I have a small section on conclusions. A lot of this is out of Martin's discussion of some things and so forth. Okay, so let me stop. I know that's a lot, and get comments, and also people may have specific things they might want to add or address or make sure it's covered. So let me stop, as I say, and see what people think. One is, of course, does this structure, you think, work well enough as a start so that we might consider it useful for the eventual communique?
I guess as like co-chair, I can abuse my privileges and jump in with my thoughts right away. Thanks for putting together all that stuff. I mean, it does show just how much you covered in these, I don't know, 14, 15 weeks of presentations. And it really is a lot of diversity in there, covering a whole bunch of things. So that's cool. And I think the overall structure is an okay start. But I'm going to play kind of devil's advocate and push it what I think is the hardest part, which is like actually synthesizing what we've been talking about. And there's just kind of, I feel there's a pretty big disconnect, and I'm just really interested in talking about it and trying to sort it out. So I come at this stuff from the perspective of Obo. In one of the notes, he said oboe ontologies have thousands of terms, which is kind of funny because the smallest oboe ontologies have thousands of terms. Right. Most of them have tens or hundreds of thousands of terms. And we have things like the NCBI taxonomy that we import, which has a couple million terms. And oboe as a whole has millions of terms. And so we have like serious scaling problems where we need to build out these ontologies with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of terms, build them, load them with things like OWL API, do quality control checks that are way bigger than any human could manually do them, and then release them. And then we want to import modules from other ontologies, which means loading in multiple ontologies with hundreds of thousands of terms and getting out a few thousand terms that you're going to need for your definitions of things. And we're doing that. And then we're also doing this like in the open as open source projects with public commits from just random people that we've never met before all over the world, doing all this stuff on GitHub and trying to coordinate, work that's being done by people who've never met each other on contributing to these ontologies and making them work. And so our tooling is built around these challenges, and they're serious challenges. And as we got other groups to present from different perspectives, they just didn't have these challenges. And so the Nowhere Graph guys were talking about ontologies of a few thousand terms, mostly pulled from other places that they could easily manage in Protege. And they were only working on them in like a small internal team. They weren't public, and they weren't worried about contributions from random people on the web. And then the graph itself is big, but the ontology part of it, what I think of the ontology part of it, the OWL part of it, is small. And and then even the bits and pieces we see of the industrial ontologies, which we mostly don't see, but like the tools like Otter that are used for building these industrial ontologies, they mostly also seem small. Maybe they have fairly rich axioms, but from my perspective, a few hundred or a few thousand terms is small. And so I feel like that's been kind of a disconnect the whole time as we go through. In Obo, we're doing lots of modeling in OWL at scale and collaborating in the public, and we need tools to support all that stuff. And then when I see other people doing these things, they don't need those tools because they don't have millions of terms to manage. And so, so there's a bit of a disconnect there, just kind of in scale and approach at what we're using OWL for and what we aren't using OWL for, and what we're using knowledge graphs for and what we aren't using knowledge graphs for. So that seems to me like a challenge that I'd like to get on the same page about for the purpose of this communique or paper.
Absolutely. I can actually, I get a transcription of what you've said and probably include that and meaningfully into the, as a, both a, something in the problem section, scaling, and how do you handle when it's, the collaboratives, are open. And we can come back to that to remaining problems. How do you bring the community? A big part is how do you bring the communities together? Well, or people are going to scale up to meaningful, large size ontologies are going to have to. They're going to run into these problems, and they're going to have to use some tools like your tools, and that's a
Mhm.
remaining problem, and probably in the conclusion section too. So all good material for the eventual communique,
But
I
are
believe.
they going to scale up? Does anyone care? Do they? I don't know. Are there people using ontologies at that scale? Like, I don't know. Do they want to do it this way? My impression so far has been no. They're happy with a few thousand terms.
Well, open science is going to lead us there no matter what, eventually, right? And even just to support the growing number of knowledge graphs, I would imagine is going to lead us to having to have more structures on the knowledge graphs to avoid inconsistencies in them. Of course, there's the big talk about using something like Shackle locally on
Mhm.
small shape parts of it, but there are larger scale structures in the eventual knowledge graphs. I think that we're going to need better tools.
Mhm.
But let me open it up again for more comments on this. So you haven't logged into to chat, so let me do that to see if there's something important happening over there. Okay, well, while people talk among ourselves.
So Ravi was asking me to clarify about ontologies. So I think hundreds or thousands of terms is small at the scale that I work on. And most of the projects I deal with have to deal with tens or hundreds or millions of terms, like OWL classes that they, they either need to import from an ontology that has a few 100,000 terms, or I don't know, that those terms are relevant for their axioms, or often importing a few terms from an ontology with millions, like the NCBI taxonomy, which is simple, but it's big. Yeah, and then knowledge graphs tend to be really large, but I'm talking specifically about the OWL ontologies. Okay, that's just clarifying.
Yes. So it was
Eddie,
pointed out that the scoping or size will make use of something like LinkML important. Sierra pointed that out, and we can include that as part of the discussion of scale.
The LinkML stuff can work. It works nicely at small scales too. It's just a matter of connecting your ontologies up to like a relational database or a Python code base, or whatever. Lots of different things. So LinkML builds on 2 decades of experience trying to actually use our ontologies in databases and other tools, and using the ontologies as a validation constraint and a modeling constraint. And yeah, it works on small projects, and it gets super important on big projects.
let me bring up a kind of a terminological issue at a very high level. Distinction between a methodology and a framework. I often see these two kind of treated almost synonymously. They're not synonymous. And when we look at all the different approaches that Gary has so very nicely written up. Which of them is a framework and which is a methodology?
Well, let me take a first crack at what I was trying to say. I was trying to frame a discussion. So I wasn't cool. I was trying to frame a discussion by using a discussion of ontological engineering methods so that we could see the life cycle and we could see where various tools might be used within the life cycle of building and using ontologies. So hopefully that.
I think that was great, but I was just asking, maybe we should look at these tools and techniques and ask which ones are frameworks and which ones are methodologies. Right, because a methodology is a more systematic kind of way of approaching problems, whereas a framework is looser. It's a kind of, just a skeleton.
Yeah. Well, there might be either other relevant concepts. Yeah, this is a question for James and the other people. Where a number of other people here are from the Obo Foundry community, which is, do you have an express methodology that is written up that could be cited as how you start, what you go through, what the phases are, what might be involved in each of those? You certainly had a diagram that I use, which is the idea of roles, which identified different aspects of work. And that could be assembled into a methodology, but I didn't necessarily see one that was written up explicitly. You certainly have principles, we know, which are very important also, another concept. But do you have something that we could use as referenced as a methodology?
I don't think we have something in that space that you're talking about. So we have our principles, and we have like detailed standard operating procedures for like, this is how you submit an ontology to the Obo Foundry. These are the steps you go through. These are the QC checks you need to pass. And then on the other hand, we have like, here are the free open source tools that you can use to implement this and make it happen. But yeah, we don't have methodologies like Neon or whatever the heck. And I mean, to be controversial about it, I suppose, they don't seem relevant to me. And I don't read those papers. And when I submit papers and people get back the reviewer responses saying like, what do you think about Neon? I'm like, that was 20 years ago, and it has almost nothing to do with what I do day to day. But maybe I'm wrong about that.
Yeah, I'm just saying we should clarify those issues. Yeah, so what you just explained is really very helpful, I think, in framing the communique as we develop it at the highest levels. Does anyone else have any comments about that?
I see that Ravi has his hand up, but I don't know if he's commenting on
Ravi,
this
you have your hand up.
latest topic.
I will comment when this thread is reaching some point. So kindly continue. I have other general questions.
Okay, Chris?
Yes, so I wanted to briefly comment on what James has previously said, which is that there are a bunch of methodologies out there and people are generally aware of them. But what I often see as a problem is that people don't necessarily know what the benefits are of adopting a certain methodology or using a certain framework. So, for example, here at the University of Oslo, we have been collaborating with an industry partner who has an ontology that includes, I think, about 250,000 terms. So it is not of trivial size. And these people are aware of the tools and methodologies that the Obo community have been developing, but they had a really hard time deciding on whether this would be actually useful for their applications. And I guess it would be really useful to have a communique that would make these benefits and the advantages of adopting the principles of the Obo community. Just some food for thought.
Robert?
Well, is this a task that the Obo community thinks is worth taking on for whatever period of time? For the communique, it's an open question. We would certainly welcome it. Having something that would benefit people outside the biomedical community also in the use of the tools is just a wonderful thing to consider. But it would take the OVO community itself to do some work in that, on that.
Yeah, I could bring that up. I mean, we have different goals from the, I don't know, I should talk to Chris about the specific industry group he's talking about. I expect we have different goals and different organizational structures, right? Which make certain of our principles and tools less useful, but some of them might still be useful. Yeah. Okay, I guess I don't have anything so useful to say, but I'll bring that up and see if other OVO people want to pursue that.
Thank you.
Robert, you had your hand up?
Thanks, Ken. Over the years, I've observed a number of questions and comments from people both in and out of the ontology community about methodologies. And one consistent question has been, is there one or more systematic methodologies for developing ontologies? And so I think in a broad sense, it's a valuable question to include in the synthesis. There are different methodologies, like James and others have pointed out, and some may or may not be of interest to particular communities or groups. But in a general sense, I think it's a valuable question. I myself am working on a particular methodology from a certain approach, and I know there are some people that would be interested in having sort of like a rigorous systematic method that might be an easy to learn approach, because there's a lot of sort of questions and from people from different disciplines where they are confused by how to get started and how to maybe complete the development of a model. So from a general sense, I think it's a valuable, it would be a valuable contribution to talk about methodology.
Great, thanks. Russell?
Any
Yeah,
other comments on this?
yes, can you hear me?
Yes,
Russell?
I can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Hi. I did some research a while back on some differences between frameworks and methodologies for some of your more general things like Zachman and ITIL and TOGAF and things like that in IT deployment and execution frameworks. And there's quite a bit of stuff over there, like PEEF and POET and enterprise architecture tools and notations. And I found that some of these frameworks were more theoretical as opposed to practice oriented, and that some of them were more business planning or enterprise related as opposed to an IT project. And it became useful for me to create something that I would call a map, where they were kind of positioned on this 2x2 grid. And it just gave a kind of a very quick and simple visualization of what the basic strength areas were. So for instance, the Zachman framework and the TOGAF framework were considered very theoretical as opposed to ITIL or some of the notations like UML or what have you. So I know it's not the same, but those are not really the same types of methodologies that you're thinking about right here. But just a kind of an idea of something that's sort of similar, and I found it actually to be very helpful for understanding the space. And I think for people who are trying to do research and trying to use an ontology and trying to that the frameworks and methodologies can be beneficial. Also, I was doing some other research into like CRISP DM and some of the SEMA and some of the other methodologies that were used for data mining. And I found that let's say, for example, 30 or 40% of practitioners used CRISP DM, and something like 15% of practitioners used SEMA, and other people used other known methodologies, and that a large portion of the practitioners invented their own framework, essentially. And I just wanted to
I would make a point.
mention
I
this.
would make a point for the sake of time, Russell. I would make a point that I think we want to emphasize practical frameworks and methodologies. There is a value to getting started with something simple, but James's point, I guess, on scale is where people are going to be going. And so I would try to focus on things that have proven and been studied as practical methods.
Well,
Can I?
yeah, that's all great. I just wanted to kind of throw that out just to mention the kind of notion of how they can be compared in some kind of a way.
Yeah, if you could,
Can I make some
if you could
comments
write
now?
up a little bit about that, Russell. Just a couple of paragraphs, that would be really
Sure.
valuable.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay, Ravi, finally.
Yeah, well, 2-3 threads I want to address. Can I go the reverse way? First, I want to address what Russell just mentioned. I have worked for 15 years as enterprise architect, so I related to a lot of words that he used. Kindly note that Zachman is not that theoretical, although filling all the cells of Zachman framework is a heroic task, and even GM and other large corporations made a dent on 1 or 2 or 3 rows, and maybe not all the cells or columns of that framework. But yes, there is a notion of a working enterprise and an implemented enterprise. And at that level, that enterprise architecture framework is very relevant, even today. And people like IBM developed the tools which others have now adopted. BPM came out of those efforts. BPMN2 was influenced in OMG, and workflows and rapid software development tools also came out of those efforts. So enterprise architecture was in a practical terms. When TOGAF came, I agree more with your comments than that it became more theoretical and sort of wishy-washy, like many DoD capability statements were made in those time frames, but they were not that practically implemented, except through DODEF and other things. So this was my comment to what Russell said. I now come back to second point where I want to just put a query and then request Sierra to clarify. It was too cryptic what you put in the chat there. So could you kindly explain to some of us the differences between LinkML and OWL? What richness does LinkML give more than OWL or RDF framework? So that's a side question, but can I continue my one area where I want to talk about what James mentioned in terms of scale. The scale is very interesting comment from you, James, and others that participated, including Gary. But the 250,000 mentioned by Chris is a good number. See, terms are supposedly reasonably separable entities which are used in ontologies. So in terms of ER type of conceptual models, these kinds of number of different terms making different entities is a mammoth. How would those numbers of terms relate to what we see in knowledge graph? That is the one question I have. And number two about these large number of terms is, what are the reasoners, inference engines, and filters that you would use to zero in on the most relevant set of terms that you might be dealing? Maybe in biontology, gene mapping, maybe in environmental research, whatever. But kindly comment on these two aspects. One is scale, how it's related to knowledge graph terms, and number two, in terms of how do you go about filtering relevance of those terms. Thank you.
Well, I am happy to try and answer. Do you want to go first, Sierra?
Those are really big questions. I was mostly turning on my video to talk about LinkML. So I don't know if I can answer all of your questions that you just nicely summarized. But I can say from one of the things you talked about, how does LinkML compete with OWL, or does it provide anything more than OWL provides? And I would say that LinkML tries not to compete with OWL. Like they should be partners in producing data models that can be useful for developers and subject matter experts where they are technologically and architecturally. So LinkML really tries to parasitize a lot of the good things about all these different modeling languages and frameworks that we have and produce semantically relevant models that reuse and incorporate ontologies as a primary focus, but also hides that complexity of OWL behind really simple to write YAML, so that developers like me who are not OWL experts can come in and still have those semantic underpinnings in their model without all of the really hard work it takes to learn some of these standards. So that's from my perspective. I'm sure if Chris Mungo was here, he would have an even better answer, but to me, I don't think they should compete. I think LinkML can be an entry point sometimes for making a data model that is underpinned with semantic expertise and reuse of ontologies, but they can produce OWL, of course, but can produce other things as well, like JSON schema, TSVs for the folks in our community that really just want to work with spreadsheets, etc. I hope that answers your question in a roundabout way.
Thank you, Sierra. That I think clarifies a lot, and I would very much appreciate, and so would, I guess, James and Gary, if you could kindly make a paragraph out of what you just said. It's very valuable for some of us because we don't get into deep depths of OWL or other, various terms that relate to software languages. Thank you. Thank you.
I will.
James, kindly help.
Yeah, Sierra answered that question very well. And then, so Ravi's asking about scaling. That was one issue, and I'm not sure there's any necessary connection between how big your ontology stuff is versus your knowledge graph. It probably, so it seemed like when the nowhere graph people were presenting, they had on ontologies of thousands of terms, and then they had in whatever statements, assertions about individuals, and they had hundreds of millions, billions of statements in their knowledge graph about particular geographical entities and what was going on, what the weather was, what events were happening in certain places, right? So they seem to be happy with a few thousand ontology terms. They could build those in Protege. They could reason over it in whatever tool they wanted from it, and then they and then that would I presume that they're using, well, they put that into their knowledge graph, and then they just assert all their individual things as having RDF type these various OWL classes, and then and then I don't even know what kind of inferences they get beyond that. but that's certainly a perfectly good way to do things. But in the OBO community, we care a lot about class level relationships between things like organisms, cells, tissues, chemicals, and diseases, and a million different things. And so we want to make all these class level statements, and we like individual projects are making the statements at the levels of individuals, and they're building databases and they're building knowledge graphs. But the OBO community is coordinating on the like ontologies, the shared vocabularies, and the class level kind of stuff. So you don't necessarily see all the knowledge graphs coming out of these things. And I don't know, that seems to me a difference, at least a big difference. I don't know, is that answering the question, Ravi? And then I can answer your other question about tools and modules and things.
No, it does partially answer. My question is, if I'm a researcher, let's say in gene ontologies or some gene mapping, and I want to see correlations among genes for particular type of diseases, or how many types of gene pools constitute a particular trend of deficiency or disease. And those kinds of questions, we hope our ontology tools, our models, our terms, and our graphs would help scientists ask those kinds of questions. And they would be familiar with some statistics, some amount of correlations and regression, etc., to be able to get some meaningful answers from those queries. So that's my question, James.
I don't know. It's not easy in my head. So we have our OWL ontologies, which are dealing with their deductive reasoning frameworks, right? So they're not about statistical correlations or anything like that. So and if you try and build statistical kind of knowledge into OWL, I don't know, I've only seen it end in disaster. So we have these ontologies which are saying like, this is just what a word means, this is what a class means related to all these other things. Then we have databases full of experimental results, which may or may not hold in practice. It may turn out that this methodology was flawed, or this gets retracted, or maybe this people accept it as true. So we have like our ontologies, and then we have our databases and our knowledge graphs, and they may contain various contingent information, but the ontology itself is supposed to maintain like declarative, deterministic, logical content. So so there's at least that distinction. And then the question is like, how much do you need at these different levels? I don't know, different projects seem to go about it in different ways. And so like the gene ontology itself is used for annotating just enormous amounts of data, where you're just saying like, we did this experiment, and then we observed this and this and this, and here are the related ontology terms that you can use to facilitate your search. Or I don't know, my ontology projects, I mean, I don't know. I feel like I'm not answering the question.
No, you are in a way also making me aware that my question itself was not right, because I expected, I am fully aware of the deterministic nature of what you just said. Only question is, when scientists ask a lot of deterministic questions, they get answers, then they build up some statistical idea or probability of where they are going with it. So I was not trying to see that you embed uncertainties in your ontologies. I was just trying to understand how we can use them as a scientist. So thank you for answering.
I would add a little bit to
good.
this. I would add a little bit in that you're building both a ontology and a knowledge graph. It's useful to have competency questions about it. What do you want to be able to answer out of this assembly of knowledge? And in terms of how an ontology gets used for a knowledge graph, it varies, of course, depending on whether your starting point is at the data level and you're taking data, creating triples out of it and structuring that, or you're starting from an ontology, which is more highly structured. and then adding instances to that. There's, there's meeting ground in between, but the point is that in each way, an ontology helps make it consistent, make this knowledge consistent within whatever assembly of knowledge you have in the ontology and the knowledge graph.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then based on Ravi's kind of clarification there, I think there's one useful thing I can add, maybe getting close to methodology, which is OBO ontologies, by and large, are designed to represent consensus knowledge in science. So they're not trying to represent cutting edge provisional kind of knowledge about what cell type might have just been discovered. What we try and represent knowledge that is more like textbook knowledge, or somewhere behind the bleeding edge of science. And the approach is to kind of minimize revision. So we are allowed to change our ontologies and fix them and update them, but we shouldn't be doing that every week. And so we want that kind of long-term stability, and we handle that with our obsolescence policies and other things, that we never delete terms. We just mark them as deprecated and then replace them with newer updated terms. So that might also answer a bit of what Ravi was getting at. We have our representations of science are somewhat conservative, and they are not right at the bleeding edge of the inferences that scientists are drawing. And there's a lot of value in that stability, I think.
Great answer, James. Great answer. How much
I see
are
that-
our tools that you showed in this series of summit lectures? How much are they helping you to achieve what you just said? So that will address also our kind of the synthesis.
I'm happy to answer that. Were you gonna do something else, Gary?
Well, I was going to say that Ashaya is on here, and while you folks don't necessarily want to work with the very edge of science as it's sort of trying to figure things out, things come up that society is interested in, like COVID, and so Ashaya was involved in that. And people were gathering data, and the question is how to organize that and systematize that. And since you guys already had Foundry already had some work in this area of the relevant entities that are involved for infections and so forth, you could quickly sort of help in that field.
Yeah.
So it can be called on for
comment on
important
that.
things.
I was involved in a couple of COVID projects that were not entirely successful. One of the elements there is ontology. So we need that stability, and we need it to be relatively up to date, right? So my Bjorn Peters, who I work with very closely on many projects at the Immunoepitope database in La Jolla, he has a phrase like, ontologies change too quickly, ontologies don't change quickly enough. And so we have all these different users who want different things at any given moment. Some of them are favoring stability, some of them are favoring up-to-dateness, and this is a very difficult balance to hit. So in our case, working with COVID stuff, we were committed to using the NCBI taxonomy to represent our organisms, including virus strains. And they have been very slow to include coronavirus and variants, SARS-CoV-2. And their taxonomy didn't match up with how people were talking about the virus and its variants, especially in the kind of early days. And so we had to patch it. And in my work, I had to override what the NCBI taxonomy was saying so that I could get statements that looked right to the scientists working on the cutting edge. And then there were, we're adding terms as quickly as we can to support things. And, but some of it's not quick enough. Yeah, maybe Asia wants to comment on that. Like she wanted a COVID ontology added to OBO, and it took a while. And then there's just general coordination problems, like data coordination problems. I got hired, I was contracted to do data integration for a few different COVID related projects. And these, the exciting thing about the early pandemic was we were bringing together all these people to work on this urgent problem. And but but people who hadn't really worked together before, and we didn't have ways of talking to each other. And it was very hard to start explaining what like data integration and quality control and ontologies mean to these people who hadn't worked with them before. And I'd say we weren't entirely successful in like emphasizing how important it was to get clean data right at capture and save time trying to manually curate it later. I don't know. In particular, like we're trying to capture clinical data, and these poor nurses and doctors are just overwhelmed at the front lines, and you're asking them to fill in a red cap form and complaining when they don't fill it incorrectly. Like it was a crazy time. So I don't know. That's my experience. I feel like I'm just babbling at this point, but that's my.
It's all very
experience
good
of
for the further problems, continued problems that need to be addressed section of the paper, the limitations. So it's just wonderful. I mean, I know that that some covert surveys at the very simplest level, trying to identify things in a standard way, have really challenges. People answer it in very different ways, and there's various categories that keep changing, even demographically. So to be able to sort of
Mhm.
make sure the samples are comparable, and I know that's a problem.
Yeah, we're getting better. Lessons learned for next time, God forbid. But yeah, I mean,
in some cases, OWL isn't the answer to these things. It's the conceptual differences that people have.
yeah, and that's come up, and maybe that should be something to emphasize in the paper. Like I use OWL for lots of things, but the value of our ontologies that we're building isn't the OWL, and it isn't even the technical artifacts. It's like building a community that conceptualizes a domain in the same kinds of way, and building that kind of consensus, which is a very slow and painful process, but it also kind of lasts, right? So it's like the old saying about like, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And the consensus building is slow, but it gives you kind of a momentum that can keep you rolling through difficult times and into the future. And I don't know, if there's one thing I'm proud of, my 15 years with OBO, that's it, that we have got like a big community with impressive momentum, with limited funding and huge gaps. And but we have a community working together at this kind of scale. It's an achievement.
Yeah, I actually have a line in the synthesis way down at the bottom from one of the conversations, which is that a community can override technical things. So it's more important than following slavishly technical methods and things. Community is very important. What the community thinks and consensus. So we have a few minutes left here. If there isn't anything burning, I just think we might spend a little moment thinking about the transition, about what's going to happen next week. So maybe let me turn it over to Ken briefly to say a few words about what goes on with the communique.
Okay. So as I said earlier, I guess not everyone was here yet. What we would like to do is to modularize, to partition the development of this communique into, smaller pieces, and then get volunteers to contribute content for each of those pieces. So we're actually getting, so we just got a piece right now from on linked data using LinkML. So this is what we're looking for in the communique, is to get these modules, which can then be organized together into the communique. Typically, we do want to have background, sort of general background material. Then we would like to have sections or subsections dealing with specific examples. So, for example, in this case, we would be talking about specific tools, methodologies, frameworks. And then we would like to have a section on challenges. So what are the limitations of tools? What tools do we still need? What features of tools would be helpful? So a statement like that could be very important in terms of helping the community to direct their efforts in the future by basically saying, I mean, this is what we need to do. And again, as I say, we like to get volunteers who will provide this content, because we can't get anything into the communique if we don't have someone actually writing it up for us. So
I guess I would add that I hope I have provoked the proper resources to sort of do a good job on some of the parts that I have sort of placed in there. I mean, Sierra, for example, can look at the link ML, which is a paragraph that I had as a holding spot, and also maybe connect it to other parts of the document that needs to be done. So that you start with a module, but then there's sort of important things, and also there might be a part of the summary, part of the conclusion section that would reflect something from that module. I think a very big part of this is the interest in bringing communities together, so that the growing, if you want to grow it, think of growing it from Obo Foundry onto other things via their tools and shared things, like ecological area is sort of shared with other domains from Obo Foundry. So I think that's definitely an important aspect of it.
And thanks,
So people
Sierra,
can sort of
for
make edits and
providing-
make comments in the document, and we'll take it from there the next time. But I hope that people will look at it and say, hey, this guy wrote this little section on oak, and he didn't quite understand it, or it connects to this, or it's in the wrong spot, and so forth. So I hope that you'll still be friends, but hopefully it's a useful start.
Thank you, Gary. I think I want to thank Sierra for making that paragraph quickly and posting it. Yeah.
well,
That's my
another
paragraph.
aspect to it is
That's my paragraph, actually, Ravi, from the document. But I'm saying that
it's-
Sierra can make a better paragraph.
Okay.
So there you
I
go.
thought Sierra posted it on Zoom chat. Or did you?
Yes,
no, that
but
was
I had
Gary.
done it on. I had done it on Zoom, and then somebody posted it on the other chat.
I did.
See,
That
we're a
I
Okay,
will-
community working together.
So then to our final note, comment here is,
Thank you.
we would like to follow up after the communique. So in some cases, we have actually had a special issue where people have produced a series of papers on the same theme, which were then published in a special issue of a journal. So that's yet another way in which we can produce material from the summit. That's especially valuable when the amount of material that gets generated exceeds what you could put in a single paper. And so there's the special issues have sometimes been quite substantial, and have the special issue on explanation was pretty thick. This is
Somehow we did without James. We
special
don't know how we
issue.
did that without James, but
How do we do this? So we actually produced quite a thick special issue as a follow-up to, it's almost a book, yeah, to one of our summits. So this will give you an idea of what we can produce, what is possible to produce after we complete a summit. So that's what we're going to be starting up next week. And I hope everyone here can join us.
if I could say
And
one more
begin this
thing, since not
process.
everybody might join us, we also learned a lot of lessons for next year, because we're going to run another summit. Sometimes we run mini sessions before the summit, like we might run them in the fall or one in the summer. We have some thoughts on that. But if there are issues in the community that sort of build on this, that improve on it as a topic for next year, you know, we'd like to hear about that, because there will be, again, a committee of people who will try to look at alternatives. I propose this, obviously, having run into James's idea. And this is the way it happens. So next year we'll be having another one, and hopefully we can leverage something from here for next year.
The
Okay.
great strength, Gary, the great strength from your and James' efforts has been including our unusual, other than usual ontology community. You got them, you got the OBO people, other biology people, other scientists interested. We had 50 people, which is very rare in our community as attendees. So I think that you have already shown some good lessons to learn from this, and we can take this further. Thank you.
Okay.
I hope Ken agrees with my comments.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
James Overton put a comment in, but is he still here?
He
Yeah, I'm
is.
still here. Just that, yeah.
Oh,
I worked
James, you
on
are still here. I
explanation in
thought you-
philosophy of science, which isn't.
thought you
seems-
disappeared suddenly.
Feel we missed an opportunity, but not having reached out to you on that one. So
Yeah, no,
you would
it's
have had to even
kind of
James,
disconnected, but
Yeah, so if you want, I can get you the material on explanation, so you can look that over. It may not be easy to obtain for you to obtain it.
well, if it's not too much trouble, sure, I would like to look at that.
okay.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
thanks everybody for coming today, and hopefully we'll see some of you and bring friends next time. Okay.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Gary.
Thanks, everyone.